We turn to Psalm 44. And this psalm speaks of the nation of Israel in a season of great defeat. It begins as follows in verse 1, 2 and 3. We have heard with our ears, O God, our fathers have told us, what work thou didst in their days, in the times of old, how thou didst drive out the heathen with thy hand, and plantest them, and how thou didst afflict the people and cast them out, for they got not the land in possession by their own sword, neither did their own arm save them. But thy right hand, and thine arm, and the light of thy countenance, because thou hadst a favor unto them. So it speaks about Israel's history that was passed on orally by the forefathers. They say we've heard it with our own ears. Our fathers have told it. The fathers had their mouth, as it were, like books. And so they had told the psalmist of the great work that God had done when he drove out the Canaanites and planted Israel in the promised land. And so it's about the days of Joshua, when at times Israel did close to nothing and God did all the work. For example, in Joshua 24 verse 12 and 13 we read, "And I sent the hornet before you, which drove them out from before you, even the 2 kings of the Amorites, but not with thy sword, nor with thy bow. And I have given you a land for which you did not labor, and cities which you built not, and you dwell in them, and the vineyards and olive yards which you planted not, of them do you eat." And other times they had to do things, they had to come to action, but at the same time, without the help of God, they would have accomplished nothing. We see it, of course, in the first city they had to conquer Jericho. God had instructed them to walk around the city a certain amount of times. They had to obey God in that, but it's actually God who brought down the walls. And the next city that they had to conquer, the city of Ai, they thought, we will have this one, that's okay, we can do it. And they forgot to obey God, and they lost. They lost many lives. And so they readjusted, obeyed God, and then things went well. Well, the point being, what the psalmist recalls is that it was God who did and got the victories for them. They always needed the face, the countenance and favor of God on their side. And so he continues then from the past to go to the present in verse 4. "Thou art my king, O God. Command deliverances for Jacob. Through thee will we push down our enemies. Through thy name will we tread them under that rise up against us. For I will not trust in my bow, neither shall my sword save me. But thou hast saved us from our enemies, and hast put them to shame that hated us. In God we boast all the day long, and praise thy name forever. Selah." In contrast to the victories that God gave them in the past, God was not doing the same in the present. And so the psalmist prays for new victories. And it was a prayer with faith and confidence. Through you, we will push down our enemies, he says. Through you. God would certainly answer. He says, we will push down our enemies. So he trusts that God will answer. By the way, this expression, to push down the enemy, comes from the manner of fighting that oxes, bulls, buffaloes and animals of that class do. They first toss their foe in the air with their horn and then push it down and trample it. The psalmist declares on behalf of Israel that his faith is in God and in his power, and not in their own strength and their own weapons. He mentions specifically the sword and the bow. Although bow and sword are used, they are not trusted in. Likewise, it's so in spiritual warfare that we are in. We may use traditional means, but we don't put our trust in them. Again, the psalmist thinks of the past victories passed on by the forefathers. You have saved us from our enemies. You have done it before. You will do it again. It is good for us too that we remember and remind ourselves of past victories that God gave us in our lives, past experiences. Verse 8 then praises God both for what he has done in the past and for what he is going to do. So there's faith, there's confidence. Would the psalm have stopped here, then we would be left with a good feeling, a positive feeling. We would be encouraged. But it continues in verse 9, and the first word of that verse changes everything. And so that's why there is this pause here between verse 8 and verse 9. Selah. It is appropriate as we go actually from the highest to the lowest. Verse 9. But thou hast cast off and put us to shame, and goest not forth with our armies. Thou makest us to turn back from the enemy, and they which hate us spoil for themselves. Thou hast given us like sheep appointed for meat, and thou scattered us among the heathen. Thou sellest thy people for naught, and dost not increase thy wealth by their price. Thou makest us a reproach to our neighbors, a scorn and a derision to them that are round about us. Thou makest us a byword among the heathen, a shaking of the head among the people. My confusion is continually before me, and the shame of my face hath covered me, for the voice of him that reproacheth and blasphemeth by reason of the enemy and avenger. The current crisis was deep. They felt that God did not fight for Israel, and they were in battle without hope. If they were to prevail over their enemies, they first had to prevail with God. And so, if they were defeated, scattered, sold into slavery, made a reproach, a scorn and a derision, it was because God's hand was behind it. Notice how the psalmist uses the word you 6 times at the beginning of verse 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 and 14. He speaks you or thou. It's obvious that he recognizes that God is behind this. They felt abandoned and had even become a negative proverb among the nations. But it feels undeserved, and thus the psalmist continues to protest to God. Verse 17. All this is come upon us, and yet have we not forgotten thee. Neither have we dealt falsely in thy covenant. Our heart is not turned back, neither have our steps declined from thy way. Though thou hast sore broken us in the place of dragons, and covered us with the shadow of death. Here the psalmist declares that they, Israel, had not forgotten God, and that they had remained faithful to his covenant. The covenant is mentioned here because there God had promised an obedient Israel to be blessed and to curse a disobedient Israel. We can read this in Deuteronomy 28, verse 1. There it says, And it shall come to pass, if thou shalt hearken diligently unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe and to do all his commandments, which I command thee this day, that the Lord thy God will set thee on high above all nations of the earth. But it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice, this verse 15, of the Lord thy God, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes, which I command thee this day, that that all these curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee. So this was before the eyes of the psalmist. If we obey, we will be blessed. If we disobey, we will be cursed. Now we did obey. Why are we not blessed? That is the protest here. God must be faithful to his part of the covenant because Israel has been faithful to their part. He's not saying that they are perfect, but their heart has not turned back and their steps have not departed from God's way. They are experiencing a suffering for which there seems to be no case. Yet God has broken them instead of jackals, translated here with dragons, and covered them with the shadow of death. Continues then verse 20. If we have forgotten the name of our God, or stretched out our hands to a strange God, shall not God search this out? For he knoweth the secrets of the heart. Yeah, for thy sake are we killed all the day long. We are counted as sheep for the slaughter. The psalmist continues here to insist that Israel had remained faithful. They had not forgotten God and they had not prayed to idols, stretched out their hands to strange idols. After all, if they would do so, or if they had done so, God would know it. He knows the secrets of the heart. And yet they are killed. They are helpless, like sheep for the slaughter. And here we learn that suffering may not always be a punishment of God. There may be battle scars. It may be inexplicable at present. But, like the psalmist, it should never make us turn away from God, but rather seek him more. Paul writes regarding this in Romans 8, verse 35 and 36, Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation, or distress, or persecution, or famine, or nakedness, or peril, or sword? As it is written, For thy sake we are killed all the day long. We are accounted as sheep for the slaughter. He quotes here Psalm 44, verse 22, and he puts it into proper context. But he also says, as a rhetorical question, shall that separate us from the love of Christ? No, it doesn't. So after the protest, back to the psalmist now turns to plea for help. Verse 23, Awake, why sleepest thou, O Lord? Arise, cast us not off forever. Wherefore hidest thou thy face, and forgottest our affliction and our oppression? For our soul is bowed down to the dust. Our belly cleaveth unto the earth. Arise for our help, and redeem us for thy mercy's sake. The words may seem a bit odd, but obviously the psalmist did not really believe that God was asleep. But that is how it felt. It's more a poetic way of speech, and apparently the psalmist had a deep enough relationship with God that allowed him to speak this way. And God, in his grace, heard him. The psalmist really felt that God had forsaken and forgotten a faithful Israel. And this idea of the Lord sleeping is actually not so strange at all. It's very vividly and even literally recorded in Matthew 8, verse 24 and 25, where we read about Jesus sleeping in the midst of the tempest, of the storm, while the disciples on the boat, they fear that they will perish. And so they say basically the same words. Why are you asleep? Wake up, we will perish. So we learn from this psalm not to get angry or frustrated with God when things go contrary to what we expect, or contrary to what we think we deserve, but rather to trust him even more, even in pain and disappointment. And so the psalmist makes his final plea, but notice that it is not on the basis of what Israel deserved, but, he says, for the sake of God's mercy. No matter what situation we are in, how unfair and undeserved it may seem, we must seek God and not turn away from it. That is what Paul also said, what we read from Romans 8. And that is maybe the most important message from this, that we get from this psalm, this contemplation of the sons of Korah, that we should turn to God and trust Him. And of course we are always allowed to plead for help. And maybe that's exactly what He is waiting for. So, though it seems desperate and it seems a protest, it's actually an encouragement and a good lesson for us. Amen.